Now we're going to talk a little bit about the researchers who started cognitive psychology and some of the movements and ways of studying cognitive psychology or cognition that they actually inspired. So we're going to start with Wundt. Wundt was actually one of the first psychologists. He was born between 1832 and 1920, and he was interested in consciousness. Consciousness is something that happens in the mind. And so the very first psychologist, or at least the first psychologist that had a research lab, was also a cognitive psychologist, though they didn't call it that at the time. So basically, because he was interested in consciousness and the elements of consciousness, he actually kind of going through Aristotle's way of thinking about things, in terms of information coming in from the environment, and that forming the basis, those experiences forming your knowledge. He basically thought, well, what goes on in consciousness, I know I have thoughts and I know I have feelings. And he said, maybe it's actually made up of these simple essential units of the mind. So right around the time, like I said, there was a lot of work in the British Associationism and the scientific method. All of that was just going whole hog in this particular time frame. And chemistry was one of the things that was actually being developed. What are the different elements, and is there any rules to it, and things like that. And the periodic table of elements was being created at that time. And he said there must be the same sort of thing that is happening in our minds, and that gives rise to consciousness. It's you mold together these different things, and you have this complex thought. What are the simplest essential units of the mind? And so he was sort of looking at a way to get at these essential mental elements that can't be broken down any further. And to pursue that, he set up the very first lab for psychological research. This was in the University of Leipzig. 1879 was when the first one was actually started. Now, the way he was going to get at that was through a method called introspection. And introspection means looking within yourself, and in this case, looking at the contents of your consciousness. And so he taught people how to do that. And it was really, really precise. So they would say, well, I see a red chair. They could use red because maybe that's an element. The chair, that you're not seeing a chair, you're seeing a concept when you say something like that. So what do you actually see? The shapes, the lights, the shadow, the location, the angle, things like that. So he basically was trying to teach his observers to get at these very, very simple elements, not these concepts that we tend to think about and perceive the world with. And so they looked inwards, and they, like I said, inner sensations, inner experiences, things like that. In doing this, he had a very rigorous, very controlled procedure for discovering these sensations that they're having and these feelings that they're experiencing consciously. One of the things that he also did, though, he realized it's like, okay, this is all a person making these observations. We can sometimes be wrong. So he tied it with other performance measures. So it's reaction times. So if something is like very striking, let's say like a bright red color, bright red, if that's very, very salient, then you probably respond to it more quickly than something that's not as salient. And so one of the things he could do is like, okay, when he says red chair, how quickly do people respond to, yes, that's a red chair, or no, that is not a red chair. Or he might actually do word associations. So like, what are some associations that you have with that? And he did that across multiple individuals. And if they had the same sort of associations, he actually figured that maybe there was some continuity, something there that multiple people were aware of. Now, this right here is very, very important for what we're going to talk about that a little bit later. Around the same period of time, we have William James. He was an American researcher, and he was also interested in the study of the mind, and was doing this about the same time as Wilhelm Wundt. However, he took a very, very different approach to it than Wilhelm did. And where Wundt was actually interested in understanding the essential components of the mind, William James was actually more interested in how the mind functioned and why it functioned the way that it did. Now, he also made observations and also did introspections on how the mind operated. And then he collected all of these observations and introspections, and he used a lot of the work of other people at that period of time that were also thinking about cognition and also doing scientific work. So and a lot of philosophers as well. And he took all of this and he wrote the book it was a 2-volume book called The Principles of Psychology, and it was published in about 1890. And it took him 12 years to put this together. It was a lot of work, but it was an extremely influential book, and it's still very, very highly regarded. I've actually got a copy of this book, and you look back at some of the things he was thinking about, and these are still some of the questions that we're addressing today when we're looking at cognitive psychology. Now, the topics of his books included things like stream of consciousness. Now, that's very much like what Wundt was actually interested in, though Wundt was looking at the elements of it, he was looking at the stream of consciousness. In fact, James was actually one of the first people that came up with this idea of a stream of consciousness. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about behaviorism and some of the effects of behaviorism, and also some of the work, like what not Wundt, but his students were actually doing. We don't study consciousness as much as we should in cognitive psychology. We're in just the past maybe 10 years, I've started seeing some cognitive psychology books address consciousness. But like you'll see in this lecture, why scientists or cognitive psychologists didn't actually study consciousness for a long time, and maybe why cognitive psychologists are still a little like, and in terms of studying it, like maybe not. It's also a very hard thing to do. The other things that James wrote about in his book, there's many things, I'm just giving you a subset of it, was emotion and habit. Your textbook actually talks a little bit about habit and his writings, like something he actually wrote about that. Time perception, imagination, and reason. So these are some of the many things that he talked about there. Functionalism kind of came out of this. And it was very much influenced by evolutionary theory at the time, because Darwin was really busy at this time coming up with this theory of evolution. And a lot of people were like, oh, that's really interesting. They're trying to tie it in with as much as they could. And so the functionalists basically worked to adapt evolutionary theories of biology to psychology. So instead of physical, mental components. One of their central premises was that the mind allowed people to adapt to their environment. This is also why functionalists differ in the way they study experimental psychology. The structuralists did this in a laboratory and observed it in a laboratory. But if you actually think that the way the mind works is a function of the environment, what that means is that you should actually be out there studying mental phenomena in real life settings. And so functionalism had that sort of real world approach. And putting people in situations and then watched how the environment affected both cognition and behavior. Titchener was a student of Wundt. And so back in the day, people would go to Germany because those are some of the best schools, and they'd be trained, and then they'd bring that back to, in this case, to the United States. And Titchener was one of these people. And he brought psychology to the United States. He was one of the first people doing that. So he was here around the same time as William James was doing his work. Now, he actually went a little bit different from what Wundt was doing, because he felt introspection was the only appropriate procedure for psychology. That extra stuff where you had to, let me go back a couple slides, where you had other performance measures to go along with introspection, like reaction times with word associations. You're like, we don't need that. And we're just going to pay attention to introspections. Now, this is problematic because when you're introspecting on yourself, it's very subjective, and there's no other way for other people to verify that your introspections are accurate or the same as somebody else's. And so one of the problems that came about this is that over time, as people were publishing, there was no agreement between labs or observers, which means that the results were non-replicable. This was really a problem because it practically, it almost killed psychology right then and there by using that particular method. But then the behaviorists came to save the day. Basically, behaviorism was this wholesale rejection of introspection and the content matter that's investigated by introspection. So that means all mental events and all processes. And Watson was the one who started this movement in 1913. He basically did this by writing the Behaviorist Manifesto. He says that we can never know what's going on inside somebody's head. There's no way to empirically verify what's going on in somebody's head. So what psychology needs to be is the science of behavior, what it is that we can see that people do in response to certain things in the environment. It's observable and it's quantifiable. And he called on others in his efforts of devising a science of psychology. That's behaviorism. All right, I'll stop here, and then there'll be another video.